For millions of people, that sound is the definition of childhood. It is the sound of Final Fantasy, of Tony Hawk, of a new era of entertainment. But inside the boardrooms of Kyoto, Japan, that sound is something else entirely. It is the sound of a mistake, a $50 billion mistake. In the early 1990s, Nintendo wasn't just a gaming company. They were a sovereign state. They controlled 90% of the global market. They had more cash reserves than major automobile manufacturers. They were untouchable. But empires don't usually fall because of an invading army. They fall because of arrogance. They fall because they believe they are too big to fail. This is the story of how Nintendo, in a paranoid attempt to protect their monopoly, accidentally handed the keys to the kingdom to their biggest rival. This isn't just a console war. This is a story about betrayal, revenge, and the most expensive contract dispute in history. Welcome to Red Ink History. To understand the betrayal, you have to understand the tyrant. Hiroshi Yamauchi. Yamauchi didn't play video games. He reportedly hated them. He was a businessman who inherited a playing card company and turned it into a global superpower through fear and absolute control. By 1990, Nintendo operated less like a toy company and more like a cartel. They used a system called the lockout chip. If you were a developer like Konami, Capcom, or EA, and you wanted to sell a game on the NES, you had to play by Yamauchi's rules. Rule 1. Nintendo manufactures every cartridge. You can't make your own. Rule 2. You pay Nintendo up front. Even if the game doesn't sell, Nintendo keeps the money. Rule 3. Exclusivity. If you release a game on the NES, you cannot release it on a Sega console for 2 years. It was a license to print money, but it bred resentment. Developers felt like serfs working for a feudal lord. Even retailers hated them. Nintendo would artificially limit supply to create hype, leaving stores with angry customers and empty shelves. Everyone, from the coders to the shop clerks, was praying for Nintendo's downfall. They just needed a weapon. That weapon was the CD-ROM. The industry was shifting. Cartridges were expensive to make, costing about $30 per unit to manufacture. They had tiny storage space. CD-ROMs, they cost $1 to print, and they held massive amounts of data. Full motion video, orchestral music, voice acting. But Yamauchi was terrified of CDs. Why? Because CDs are easy to copy. He feared piracy would destroy his iron grip on the market. However, he couldn't ignore the future. He needed a partner, someone to build a bridge to this new technology, but someone he could control. Enter Sony. Sony in the late 80s was the Apple of its day. They made high-end electronics. They did not make toys. Within Sony, a young engineer named Ken Kutaragi was an outcast. He loved video games. His bosses hated them. Kutaragi had to work in secret. He literally hid his involvement with Nintendo from his own superiors, building the sound chip for the Super Nintendo at night. When his bosses found out, they almost fired him. But the CEO, Norio Oga, saw a spark. He let Kutaragi proceed. In 1988, a deal was struck, a marriage of convenience. Sony would build a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo. It was to be called the PlayStation. And this is where the red ink begins to spill. Nintendo, usually so shark-like in negotiations, made a fatal error. They didn't read the fine print closely enough. Kutaragi, desperate to prove Sony's worth and secure his own job, had inserted a specific clause. The contract stated that while Nintendo owned the cartridge games, Sony would retain the rights to the CD-ROM format. This meant Sony could license movies, music, and crucially, video games on CD without paying Nintendo a single cent. When Minoru Arakawa and Howard Lincoln, the heads of Nintendo America, finally deciphered this contract, they turned pale. They realized this wasn't a partnership, it was a Trojan horse. If this console launched, Sony would control the disc manufacturing. They would control the licensing. They would slowly strangle Nintendo's cartridge business and take over the industry from the inside. They flew to Kyoto immediately. They stormed into Yamauchi's office. They told him, if we let this happen, we are creating our own replacement. We will be working for Sony in 5 years. Yamauchi didn't get angry, he got even. He sent Howard Lincoln to Europe, specifically to the headquarters of Sony's biggest rival, Philips. June 1991, the Consumer Electronics Show in Chicago, the biggest tech stage on Earth. On day one, Sony is triumphant. They announced the PlayStation partnership with Nintendo. The press cheers. Sony executives pop the champagne. Olaf Olafsson, the head of Sony America, goes to sleep that night thinking he has secured the future of the company. But he didn't know that Howard Lincoln was waiting in the wings. The next morning, 9 a.m., the Nintendo press conference. The room is packed. Sony executives are sitting in the front row. They're smiling. They expect Nintendo to hype up the partnership. Howard Lincoln walks to the podium. He adjusts the microphone. He looks at the crowd. He doesn't mention Sony. Instead, he says, Nintendo is pleased to announce that we have partnered with Philips to develop a CD-ROM drive for the Super Nintendo. Silence. Then, chaos. Reporters are scrambling to find phones. Sony executives are looking at each other, faces draining of color. It wasn't just a business pivot, it was a public execution. Nintendo had left Sony at the altar in front of the entire world. The betrayal was absolute, and to add insult to injury, the deal with Philips was a disaster. It produced nothing but failure, including the infamous CD-I console and the worst Zelda games ever made. But Nintendo didn't actually care about Philips. They just wanted to kill the Sony deal. They calculated that Sony, embarrassed, defeated, and with no gaming experience, would pack up their toys and go home. It was a calculated risk, and mathematically it made sense. But they forgot one thing, the human element. They forgot about the rage of Ken Kutaragi and the pride of Norio Oga. Back in Tokyo, the mood was funereal. The Sony board of directors wanted to kill the project immediately. They said, "We are a serious company. Why are we chasing after Nintendo? They humiliated us. Let's cut our losses and go back to making stereos." Ken Kutaragi was about to lose his life's work. He had one card left to play. He requested a meeting with Norio Oga, the president of Sony. The meeting took place after a long executive dinner. Tensions were high. Kutaragi didn't talk about profits. He didn't talk about market share. He appealed to Oga's samurai spirit. He looked the president in the eye and said, "Are you going to just accept what Nintendo did to us? Are we going to let them get away with this humiliation?" Oga slammed his fist on the table. "Do it," he shouted. "Build it and crush them." That fist slam was the moment the PlayStation was truly born. Sony went to war, but Kutaragi knew they couldn't beat Nintendo at their game. They couldn't make a better Mario. Nintendo had 20 years of experience making games. Sony had 0. So they decided to change the battlefield. Strategy 1, the technology. Nintendo was betting on 2D sprites. They thought 3D was a gimmick. Sony bet the farm on 3D polygons. They wanted games to look like movies. Strategy 2, the developers. While Nintendo was still bullying developers with high cartridge fees and strict censorship, Sony rolled out the red carpet. They offered cheap CD manufacturing. They offered creative freedom. They went to the developers and said, "Nintendo treats you like servants. We will treat you like partners." The turning point came with Squaresoft. Square had been Nintendo's loyal ally for a decade, but they wanted to make Final Fantasy VII, a massive cinematic epic. Nintendo told them, put it on a cartridge. Square did the math. The game would require 13 cartridges. It was impossible. Sony offered them a CD. When Square defected to PlayStation, it sent a shockwave through the industry. The king had lost his strongest knight. Strategy 3. The culture. Nintendo marketed to kids. Sony marketed to you. They hired wipeout artists and club DJs. They put PlayStations in nightclubs. They made gaming cool. While Nintendo was still focused on colorful mascots, Sony introduced Crash Bandicoot, who literally stood in a parking lot with a megaphone yelling at Nintendo's headquarters in their commercials. But the war was ultimately decided by one number. May 19, 1995, the first Electronic Entertainment Expo, E3. Sega, desperate to stay relevant, announced their new console, the Saturn. They panicked and launched it early. They announced the price, $399. It was expensive. The crowd groaned. Then Steve Race, the head of PlayStation America, walked up to the podium. He carried a stack of papers. He looked like he was about to give a 30-minute keynote speech. He shuffled the papers. He leaned into the mic. $299. And he walked off. The room erupted. It is widely considered the greatest mic drop in corporate history. With one word and a $100 price difference, Sony obliterated the competition. The result was a massacre. Nintendo finally released the N64 a year later. It was a powerful machine, but they stuck to cartridges. Cartridges cost $30 to make. CDs cost $1. Third-party developers abandoned Nintendo in droves. They couldn't afford the red ink. The PlayStation went on to sell over 102 million units. The Nintendo 64 sold just 32 million. For the first time in history, Nintendo was not the king of gaming. They had been dethroned by the very machine they commissioned. Today, the gaming landscape is different. Nintendo retreated into a blue ocean, focusing on innovation and family fun with the Switch, creating a market where they have no competition. Sony dominates the high-performance market, but the scars of 1991 remain. The story of the PlayStation is a masterclass in the law of unintended consequences. Nintendo tried to keep 100% of the pie, and in doing so, they lost the bakery. They proved that in business, your most dangerous enemy isn't the one across the street, it's the partner you betray across the table. This has been Red Ink History. If you enjoyed this deep dive, we are working on a documentary about the collapse of Sega, a company that had everything and lost it all. Click the subscribe button so you don't miss it. And remember, always check the fine print.